Welcome to this reading group on Catherine Malabou's destructive plasticity. The starting point, not unusual in the case of Malabou, is Jacques Derrida. She mentions often in this regard On Touching by Derrida, the book in which he engages with Nancy's philosophy. And the book is roughly, to make a long story short, the book is dedicated to self-relation as the key component of subjectivity. Self-relation as, in a way, the foundation of the whole idea of Western subjectivity. And again, to make a long story short, what interests Malabou in this book is the inseparability between autoaffection and heteroaffection, namely the encounter with an otherness at the very core of the encounter of subjectivity with itself. So in other words, Western subjectivity as grounded in self-reference, subject in encountering itself, in relating to itself, encounters an otherness, and hence otherness is at the core of Western subjectivity as self-relating. Again, I won't delve into the intricacies of Derrida's and Nancy's argument here. I will just cut very quickly to what interests Malabou in terms of what she sees, or what she sees as the limits of this approach. And the limits of this approach, the limits of defining the inseparability between autoaffection and heteroaffection at the core of subjectivity in this way, is a certain overlooking of the body, so to speak. In other words, defining the subject as relating to itself as an otherness makes the subject something unattainable to itself in terms of a lack, in terms of an absence. So there is some kind of residual component of negativity in the self-relation that defines subjectivity the Western way. And this residual negativity, this focus on absence, this focus on lack, is something that is a problem for Malabou. And she reproaches more or less the same thing to Deleuze and to the idea of body without organs. The idea of body without organs, according to Malabou, is yet another way to displace the importance of the body and to make the body occupy a position that is not so central after all. Although she recognizes that Deleuze takes a few steps in the right direction by recognizing the role of affect intended a la Spinoza in the process. So as we will see, particularly in the next sessions, in the next few weeks, Spinoza's affects are an important component of Malabou's destructive plasticity as well. So she recognizes at least this to Deleuze. She recognizes that Deleuze sees the importance of self-affection in self-consciousness, according to Spinoza. And she recognizes how Deleuze recognizes that for Deleuze, self-consciousness is a matter of self-feeling, of feeling. The feeling of itself is a matter of feeling, as opposed to a disembodied thing, as per, for instance, Descartes most famously. And so, while acknowledging that Deleuze takes a few steps in the right direction, thanks to Spinoza and thanks to the affects as Spinoza would intend it, she still ranges Deleuze along with Derrida and others in conceiving of the self-relation that grounds subjectivity too much in a negative way, too much in terms of an absence, of a lack, and in a way that doesn't acknowledge to the body the importance that it should have. And so this is essentially why Malabou at some point turns to neurobiology and recommends philosophy to turn to neurobiology to find a model of subjectivity that doesn't need any reference, even or direct or indirect, to an absence or to a lack or to some kind of negativity, to account for the inextricability between autoaffection and heteroaffection, which does ground subjectivity, according to Malabou as well. So Malabou does not contest at all that some kind of connection, the kind of vital connection exist between autoaffection and heteroaffection. She just proposes that the terms of this co-implication can be found in a more accomplished way in neurobiology. Neurobiology offers a model for this co-implication between autoaffection and heteroaffection that is grounded on the direct presence of the body as opposed to any idea of unattainability between the subject and itself, as it were. As opposed to any over-reliance on difference in terms of absence, in terms of lack. And to this end, she relies especially, I would say, on Antonio Damasio, along with other big name of the disciplines like Ramachandran, Mark Solms, Dennett, and so on and so forth. She has a fairly wide range of neurobiological references that are the ones that you have also read in your readings for this session. But again, it's probably the key reference of it all is Antonio Damasio, and it is to a quick summary to Damasio's model for subjectivity that I will now turn by sharing my screen. At some point in one specific page of the readings for this session, there was a particularly helpful summary of Damasio's position on subjectivity. And I should like to not only share the screen, but probably read this summary out loud, literally, because it is particularly helpful. Damasio distinguishes three kinds of self within the self: the proto-self, core consciousness, extended consciousness, and the autobiographical self. The proto-self is the non-conscious, purely organic neural self. It is made of the interconnected and coherent collection of neural patterns that, moment by moment, represents the internal state of the organism, that is, the neural map the organism forms of itself. This map helps the organism to regulate and maintain its homeostasis, which is continuously disturbed by intruding objects. This preservation of life implies an attachment of the self to itself. Emotion plays an important part in this process. Then the conscious core self emerges, which is the zero-level form of consciousness, also called thick consciousness, the locus of the feeling of, just a second, I have to, the feeling of ourselves. The feeling of existence coincides with the being of an individual. As the first form of subjective ownership and agency, it is a modification of the proto-self, which implies the distinction between me and others. The core self may be determined as a pure affective awareness with no cognitive function. Eventually, the core self is supplemented by the autobiographical self. The autobiographical self, Damasio writes, is based on autobiographical memory, which is constituted by implicit memories of multiple instances of individual experience of the past and of the anticipated future. The invariant aspects of an individual's biography form the basis of autobiographical memory. Contrary to the preceding types, this autobiographical self is conscious. This model is about some form of dialectic between a tendency toward homeostasis, which, as we will see in the next few sessions, in the next few weeks, Malabou compares repeatedly to Spinoza's conatus. And this tendency to homeostasis happens through some kind of self-mapping of our neural connections onto themselves in such a way, initially in a kind of a non-conscious way. That would be the proto-self. And of course, this tendency toward homeostasis of our brain-body compound is perturbed inevitably by external stimuli, but that of course triggers a renewed form of self-mapping over and over again. And so it is in the dialectic between these two contradicting tendencies, namely a tendency toward homeostasis of our body-brain compound in the forms of this self-mapping, both conscious and not, and the perturbation of this homeostasis through our external stimuli. There are quite a few things to be noticed in this model before we move on. One of which is the fact that this kind of one of which the most immediate one is that we still have in another form the inseparability between autoaffection and heteroaffection that with which we have started, because by this kind of self-mapping is not as simple taking stock of pre-existing neural connections in an objective way. When this self-mapping occurs, this is already tantamount to a key perturbance or modification in the system of connection that is being mapped. This kind of encounter of the subject with itself, even in the non-conscious form of the proto-self, is tantamount to an encounter of the subject to an otherness which becomes itself once that it is self-mapped. And this self-mapping, another thing that is important to notice, does not happen linguistically. So language is out of the way, is not something that happens through language. And in the last session a couple of weeks ago, we mentioned a certain gap between Malabou's views and, for instance, the Lacanian model of subjectivity. And this is also an instance in which this gap is rather wide, in the sense that, according to this neurobiological model, language does not have a particular preeminence, does not have a particular importance in this self-mapping that grounds subjectivity. Of course, if we want to stay on that track, it could also this process of self-mapping can even be defined as some kind of mirror stage without a mirror, so to speak, but a kind of mirror stage that is completely incompatible with the externalized mirror image that grounds the whole of Lacanian's model of subjectivity, because this kind of mirroring happens wholly internally in Malabou's neurobiological informed model. So yeah, through this model in which the various stages, we have seen the three stages through which the initial self-mapping of the neural connections get from not being conscious to some kind of consciousness into the autobiographical self through the key intermediary second stage of the core consciousness. So through these stages, we have a conflictual model in which self-relation happens only, again, conflictually and not not simply in terms of mirroring one preceding state through a representation that replicates a pre-existing state. And this enables these premises enable Malabou to get out of the way, by one and the same token, determinism and deconstruction, which is, let's say, the way through which these neurobiological premises assume some kind of philosophical importance according to Malabou. Determinism is out of the way because although Malabou excludes that there can be any other route, any other ground for subjectivity than the sheer neural connections that form our consciousness and also our proto-self, even though she rules out that subjectivity can be other than, can be elsewhere than in the sheer play of undoing and doing again of these neural connections over and over. And she does state openly that this and no other is the essence of subjectivity, if there is one, and there is one for Malabou. So Malabou does state that the essence of subjectivity is such and is there only in the neural connections that make the subject. However, that doesn't mean that from this, what does not ensue is some kind of presupposition to something like determinism, quite simply because from the neural dimension, from the sheer connections of, from the sheer dimension of the connections between neurons that constitute us. So from this dimension to the dimension of the mental, which is the dimension in which, in one way or another, consciousness enters the frame, even if partly, as in the case of core consciousness, the second stage of the tripartite structure that we have seen. So the passage between one of the other is never smooth. It's never the neuron determining the mental, but there is also some kind of constitutive leap through which we can have access to the neural only by getting to the mental, which in turn we determines in such a way, in some way, the pre-existing state of the neural. So yeah, there is never a smooth passage between one and the other, but there is always some kind of leap. Or in other words, difference here is always shaping, is always formative, is always self-fashioning, as opposed to being something like an absence between something and something else that cannot touch one another. There is in the neural something like origin that cannot be attained if not through transformation, namely if not through the transformation into the mental. And in this dynamic, in this non-deterministic dynamic, Malabou sees something like a correspondence between a certain philosophical horizon that she sees represented particularly in Derrida and neurobiological research. She sees neurobiological research as, in a way, Derrida translated into the bodily, as opposed to being confined into something like a trace or a deferral. And so with this we come to the other thing that this model gets away with that being deconstruction. The key thing to be kept in mind here, and again I'm summarizing a very long story in just a couple of sentences, but the key thing here that needs to be considered is that these kinds of neural connections challenge, defy the very distinction that we may take for granted, but is not in principle take for granted, between connection and gap. In other words, these kinds of connections are at the same time something like gap between neurons and connections between neurons. The connections between neurons are at the same time also a gap and the other way around. Now, those among the participants to this seminar that come from film, like myself and at least a couple of my colleagues that are connected, can think here as a useful reference point to the second tome of the Deleuze's cinema book, because this is precisely the kind of connection that is being thematized into that volume, namely the kind of connection that is neither a connection nor a separation, but something that challenges the very distinction between the two. And this very status of the connections itself is something that has to do very much with the way neural connections are made and unmade through the processes that we have seen summarized in that tripartite definition that I read a few minutes ago. And so in this way, there is not something that, in this way, something like Derrida's deferral is directly embodied into something like a system of neural connections. Deconstruction is no longer a philosophical hypothesis, but it's something which happens all the time in the neural connections in our brain, and it is always accompanied by reconstructions. It is never, in one way or another, left loose, but it always give way to some other system of connection. And so yeah, or in other words, since we have taken one step in Derrida's direction, the trace here has a body and it has a form. The neural connections are the prototype of a kind of trace, namely a kind of absence that cannot be fully restored into presence, like the proto-self, which, as we have seen, changes the very moment that it shifts into the mental dimension. So that is the prototype of something which is at the same time close to something like the unattainability of Derrida's trace, but at the same time cannot but have a form. It always has a form. It always has a body. And hence, at the same time, Malabou sees this model as, at the same time, the ultimate translation into presence of Derrida's model, and something which challenges Derrida's model the very moment that it is translated into presence. Presence is, or in other words, the neurobiological model of subjectivity is Derrida, except for the taboo of presence, as it were, which is no longer a taboo, because the trace is never in contradiction with form, but it presupposes it. It is presupposed by it. So much for the roughly the first two readings that were assigned in the series of readings for this session. I will leave the last few minutes of this half an hour introduction to the last of the three readings of the that were assigned for this session. And the idea that Malabou starts with in this third reading, and that runs through also what has been said so far, is that it is no longer possible, thanks to the newer research in neurobiology, to think of the brain as in naive terms of center. In other words, as it was still the case, Malabou highlights for Bergson, for instance, or for part of the cybernetics of the 20th century, it is no longer possible to think of the brain as something like a telephone central exchange, namely something that receives passively impulses from the rest of the body and distributes impulses as much passively as some kind of impersonal agencies that receives and then redistributes impulses from and to the body mechanically, so to speak. Then there will be an interesting tangent to take, and that Malabou only sketches when she mentions Dennett in passing, according to which machines themselves do not work that way, in the sense that machines themselves make hypotheses, receive feedback, and hence machines themselves are no longer, in most cases, readable in mechanical terms. But that is again a tangent that would be interesting to take, and Malabou herself just sketches. The basic idea remains the fact that it is no longer possible to think of the brain in this way. It's no longer possible to think of the brain as this kind of, again, telephone central exchange, as she calls. The very way that the brain is structured is one that defies and challenges the very idea of center, insofar as there is no real center of the brain, except then in the actual connections that are established, undone, and reestablished over and over again. And so, as opposed to a center managing things and directing things, the center is everywhere, so to speak. The center is everywhere, is every place where connections happen and are undone and happen again. And yeah, and again, it is important to stress, as we did a few minutes ago, that the way that these neural connections are undone and redone over and over, thanks to this dialectic of self-mapping, the natural homeostatic self-mapping, and external perturbances. So the way that these connections are undone and redone over and over again cannot follow any predetermined pattern, because such predetermined pattern is not there. That only happens through the plastic capacity of the brain to undo and redo these connections over and over. So it's a trial and error skill, as opposed to a model that is followed by these connections in their being undone and redone over and over again. So there is no predetermined path to follow, as opposed to the brain's own capacity to do that by, again, simplifying trial and error. Once that we have said that, the key issue in this third reading of the series of readings that was assigned for these sessions is that there is a correspondence, according to Malabou, between what we know of the brain at this stage, namely between the brain, the way we know it in this way now, and the way that the world is organized. Or, to put it in other terms, the way that the world is self-organized through us, the way that we organize the world that we live in. And this is an idea that, of course, Malabou does not originally introduce. It's something, for instance, again, which Deleuze had dealt with, especially in the last few years of his life. So Malabou's assumption is that the way that the world is organized, including at the socioeconomical level, corresponds in some significant ways to the way that the brain is structured, especially to the way that the brain is structured according to what we know of the brain. Once again, what it is important to highlight is that this does not mean that there is a relationship of strict determination from one to the other. So it's not that the world is shaped in that way because originally the brain is structured in such or such other way. It is not that the structure of the brain determines the structure of the world, of the or the socio-economical world in particular, which is the one that particularly interests Malabou in this essay. But rather, Malabou's point is that there is a kind of gray area, an indeterminate intersection between the biological and the cultural, or the biological and the social. And so there is a mirroring between these two dimensions that does not really have an origin as to one dimension that should come first, that would come first and determine the way that the other would be. There is a key co-implication between the two dimensions. Or, as we have said the other time in the other session 2 or 3 weeks ago when talking about Malabou's stance on feminism, there is something like an empty intersection between the biological and the cultural, between the biological and the social, which makes it so that there are phenomena that are at the same time biological and cultural, biological and social, without the possibility, without there being the possibility to establish which of these two dimensions comes first. So, in other words, she recommends us to learn to deal with this basic indiscernibility between the biological and cultural, which makes it so that some phenomena are both at the same time or neither at the same time. But in any case, not one or the other of these two dimensions as informing the other in a top-down deterministic way. And the phenomenon that interests Malabou particularly when it comes to this intersection between the biological or the neurobiological and the social / cultural in this essay is a certain latest, at least in the time when she was writing in the late 2000s, arrangement of late capitalism named network capitalism, especially as studied by Luc Boltanski and F. Chiapello a few decades ago, in fact. But probably it's still an accurate model in quite a few ways. So what Malabou notices in the studies, in the very recent studies of network capitalism, is a certain emphasis on flexibility in the corporate environment. Namely, again, I will not spend very many words because it's probably a phenomenon that is very well known to all of us. There's a certain emphasis in the corporate environment to encourage self-entrepreneurship, the ability to establish networks even across different areas of specialization. So there is an emphasis on autonomy. There is an emphasis to some extent even on transgressiveness, an emphasis on the grassroots. So on principle, there's a very strong emphasis on what would contradict the earlier stages of corporate capitalism, which would be very much top-down, essentially, and very much hierarchized. This emphasis on the overcoming of the hierarchies that structured so much of the earlier corporate phases of capitalism have now been replaced by its opposite, essentially, by an emphasis on, again, working on one's own, on establishing spontaneous networks across different areas, and so on and so forth. Now, and she notices that this kind of flexibility mirrors the kind of flexibilities that our neural connect that characterize also the perpetual game of doing and undoing of our neural connections. There's a whole part of the readings that I won't go into, and it's the one on the new phenomenon of marginality, of social marginality that this emphasis creates. This will be the matter of rather the next session, the fourth session. So for time reasons, I will leave temporarily this aside. But what I should insist on in these last few minutes before I leave the floor to the Q&A is that Malabou insists in this reading too that flexibility, especially the flexibility emphasized in this new corporate environment, is not plasticity. And this is the key point. There is a key difference between plasticity and flexibility. Those who were here 3 weeks ago for the second session might also recall that another distinction, that Malabou also made another distinction in other books between plasticity, although she kind of leaves it loose, but it is very much possible to imply from Malabou's readings that Malabou distinguishes firmly plasticity from mimesis. And there is a passage indeed in the readings that goes in the same direction, namely, I read it verbatim, rather than displaying a real tension between maintenance and evolution, that being the dialectic that we have seen at play in every instant of our brain, flexibility confounds them within a pure and simple logic of imitation, mimesis, and performance. It is not creative, but reproductive, and normative. So, in other words, flexibility is Darwinian. Darwinian in the vulgar sense. Flexibility is something like adapt or die. Flexibility would be something like something does not acknowledge its own limits, whereas plasticity acknowledges them and, as we have seen in the very first session, makes it part of the coordinates of plasticity itself. Plasticity being not only, as we have seen from session one, giving form and taking form, but also destroying form. And so the limits are not transcendentally confined to something unattainable and unreachable, but are part and parcel of the dialectic which grounds plasticity. So flexibility refuses the idea of limits. Plasticity does acknowledge the idea of limits and the idea of destruction of form. And indeed, according to plasticity, the self-fashioning of the subject is all about the destruction of form. So what she ultimately proposes, faced with this analogy between neurobiology and the latest arrangement of network capitalism, is to refuse the idea of flexibility in favor of plasticity, namely to reappropriate subjectively the idea of the destruction of form, which of course in terms of plasticity means literally the destruction of subjectivity, for the sake of self-fashioning. Self-fashioning cannot happen without appropriating subjectively and self-consciously, quite literally, the idea of destruction, the idea of destruction of form as inherent to the game and grounding the game of taking form and receiving form, which plasticity ultimately is. And now, last thing before I get to the Q&A, it is probably clear now why Malabou maintains that not only philosophy should turn to neurobiology, but the opposite thing is also true, namely that neurobiology needs philosophy in one way or another. Because if we intend plasticity in this way, in other words, if we maintain that plasticity is something distinct from flexibility, only if we take plasticity to be something essentially distinguished from flexibility, and only maintaining this distinction, neurobiology can see the brain's flexibility in terms of plasticity. And in other words, only if we maintain this distinction, neurobiology can regard the brain's plasticity as something different from some kind of ingrained destiny in the structure of the brain themselves. So the risk for neurobiology is to naturalize the brain's own plasticity into something like the more flexible it is, the better, which instead is something which comes ideologically from a certain arrangement of society outside of the brain. And again, all of this said while keeping a certain co-implication between these two dimensions. But yeah, the risk for neurobiology would be to maintain wrongly that flexibility is something like a natural the maximization of flexibility is something that inherently does good to the brain without limits. And philosophy helps, according to Malabou, neurobiology framing this flexibility in more proper terms of plasticity, namely mainly by freeing this idea from the idea that demaximization of flexibility is an inherent good, is something that inherently would help the brain. Again, I'm simplifying a lot, but I hope that I render the idea. I will be glad now to leave the floor to questions. Regarding the split between neurons and mental representation, I think it's interesting to see in parallel another book of Malabou's, Before Tomorrow, Epigenesis and Rationality. There she goes in depth to address the gap between the biological and the symbolic as epigenetic development. Instead of genetic determinism, in epigenetics, the agent is capable of self-transformation to learn to adapt while retaining its form. Yeah, definitely. Again, epigenesis is something I have left out of this seminar series just for the sake of space, just for the sake of time. But yes, it is exactly this. It is again, if we keep the Derridian root of Malabou's engagement with neurobiology, is something like an origin with finishes to finish, as it were. So it's the idea of origin as finally becoming something retroactive in some way, or something that becomes itself only when it is betrayed. And so yeah, epigenesis largely follows this pattern.
Pages 38 and 39 from the PDF that you sent us, it's really when she's going to use the lesson to define these ideas of and she has a very interesting sentence there, that is, the plasticity of the brain is the real image of the world. And I mean, even though I kind of disagree with her sometimes, I really like that sentence, and I think it's very like productive for us here. In a way, what is different from what Deleuze and Guattari are going to propose in What is Philosophy is that the brain is the body. And I think that's the moment that she really, in a way, disagrees. And I think then you see that Deleuze and Guattari are actually Freudian and she isn't, and she's trying to put something else. And as we were discussing, I think what loses in that elaboration is the notion of the clinic. So philosophy being a really part of the society and like trying to produce new ways of listening. And I think we lose when she proposes this idea, especially, for instance, we were talking with Thomas Lamar, and Thomas Lamar really makes the difference there when thinking about Japanese animation and moving images, when the robots stop being piloted from the heads and they start being piloted from the guts, from the center of the body. And I think this is super important to think with the affections, but the affections that the body itself is producing. So I don't know. I think sometimes it's more of a comment that maybe we can discuss. Sometimes she goes a lot into philosophy, and then philosophy is not very much applied on this clinical fact of like transforming, and then it is too much discourse.
The key word here would be framing, simply, in the sense that she's not interested in clinic, but she's interested in like first framing philosophy in such a way that it does not fall prey too much to the risk of philosophy. And then framing neurobiology in such a way that neurobiology does not fall prey too much to falling into what would otherwise be the risk of neurobiology. And later on, and here I get back to what I mentioned 3 weeks ago in the second session, then she had framed feminism in such a way so as to have feminism avoid the risks of the risk that feminism would otherwise fall prey to, which according to her are the risks of non-essentialism, anti-essentialism, which for her is as much of a risk as essentialism itself. So yeah, definitely, yes, we do not find a real interest in clinic in Malabou, because the main essay, the main interest is in framing in this term.
I'm reading Catherine Malabou's Stuff Thief, Philosophy and Anarchism. In this book, she defines kinetic self and she relates subjectivity with life, form of life, like Agamben's life, form of life, and we can't separate our subjectivity from our lives. And it is very important, you said, Marco, that she differentiates plasticity from flexibility, because de facto anarchism, or as you said, network capitalism, try to navigate us through these concepts. She wants to get rid of this government paradigm, because in school, in family, with our all living, we learn this, and she suggests for me in Berlin lessons, read Alice Canetti and try to learn unlearning. I mean, we learn how to govern ourselves.
So essentially, but I will partly demand that to the and partly delegate that to the next few sessions. What I would say as relevant to this session in terms of anarchy, the way that you have introduced it, in the last few minutes, is something like, yes, anarchy is this kind of point of indiscernibility between passivity and activity, which is again very much literally the structure of subjectivity in terms of, if we think of it as we should in very traditional terms of co-implication between autoaffection and heteroaffection. What she's saying is that flexibility does not help us in finding this complication as much as rigidity. What she says is that flexibility and rigidity are in the same side. Flexibility are on the side of domination, even though it is much more clearly in the rigidity is much more literally and in your face on the side of domination, but flexibility no less so. What the place where this indistinguishability between activity and passivity ultimately is plasticity, which is one in which is not a simple presupposition of originlessness, but a kind of origin that is being transformed. And you mentioned Agamben. So essentially, in that book, she goes through 5 examples of, again, I'm simplified, people who kind of got it right, but not quite. So she always finds that little something that doesn't make them anarchist enough, in a way. Again, I'm simplifying a lot, but this is pretty much the point. In the case of Agamben, it's the fact that he himself couldn't get rid of the temptation to think in terms of inclusions. So he thinks of an area in which this co-implication between passivity and activity happens. What Malabou suggests is that we think of that in terms not in spatial terms of areality. And yeah, so we and correspondingly, we do not need to leave the idea of origin behind.
Maybe in philosophy, for example, origin, I don't understand what you mean with origin, because we are bodily creatures. I mean, of course, we are positioned in somewhere. That's maybe the ground. I can't say the origin. Maybe my origin is my mother. I just want to add something. For example, she criticizes Rainer Schurman and Deleuze because Deleuze put so much effect on autoaffection, as you said, and she doesn't reject autoaffection, but it's unconscious process most of the time. I mean, autoaffection, when we feel that we are thirsty, something like this. I mean, they're in subliminal level, and then we feel. He also criticized Schurman because he says self-constitution as anarchistic subject. He doesn't say anarchist, just anarchistic, because attributes, I mean, this categorization also she rejects anyway. But she finds some kind of still government residuality in this kind of thinking. So she projects the dog side, I mean.
Yeah, so the whole book is written against the idea of separating anarchy and anarchism, because this is yet another way to re-enter the whole idea of dominance.
Exactly. I mean, for example, in ontological energy, it is good to say the multiple choices. I mean, to choose the one it's not okay, to accept this tragic situation and live with this. She suggests, I guess, in politics.
And it's interesting that Michel Henry is from the 20th century, and Behind is from the 18th century. So it's interesting that there are four French phenomena. They were statesmen, they were people doing politics, and they were bureaucrats writing laws and doing philosophy. And it's a philosophy that is very applied, it's very body linked, and it's linked to processes. And it's immediately after the French Revolution, so they were rethinking. They were putting together both the positive. It was the origin of positivism, and it was the big revolution. Well, the epistemic revolution from the French Revolution. So it's everything at the same time.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but one possible way to put it would be that Malabou is yet another in the very rich strand that tries to, correct the possible distortions that positivism comes with. And of course, in a lot of cases, it's by marginal figures, but it's true that for the past X number of centuries, it's a strand that has been very, very rich in all ways, like both in quantitative terms and qualitative terms. So yeah, it's something along these lines, definitely, that Malabou wants to insert herself in. So yes, definitely. Thank you very much, Angela, for having contextualized what we have been saying so far in this fashion, because indeed this is the point, and this is the context that we're playing it.
Do you think that transformation in plasticity that goes from trauma is pretty much connected to the notion of the crypt?
DNA is also another good reference point in the EPG that Rokas has had introduced. So the point in short would be that for flexibility removes the original, the perspective of an origin altogether. Plasticity sees origin in terms of transformation. And yeah, so not as something fixed, but something that can only be there if insofar as it changes into itself. So in short, the distinction between the two is that in flexibility there is no origin, and in plasticity there is no origin insofar as it always transforms itself into itself. So it's a narrow difference, but a crucial one. Thank you all for connecting to the session, and see you in the next session. Thank you very much.